Prologue. The solitary camel picked its way down the stony slope. It seemed to know exactly where it was going. It looked no different from any other camel, its coat mangy and matted with dried mud. The only unusual thing about it was that it carried a pannier load strapped across its back and yet was unescorted. Only its agitated manner and the glazed expression in its eyes gave clues to the fact that it was addicted to opium. At the bottom, the animal stopped and stiffened. The big, imperious nose lifted nervously and the nostrils flared, detecting the scent of humans on the hot, dry wind. Across the valley, Ahmed Rahmani, a captain in the Iranian gendarmerie, lowered his binoculars. He was responsible for this remote, mountainous section that bordered with Afghanistan. He knew about the camel couriers that had regularly been fed opium gum and conditioned to follow a special secret route in the knowledge that they'd get more at the journey's end. Captain Rahmani also knew that on one of those craggy heights to the east, a group of heavily armed bandits was watching the camel's progress. They were dangerous men. Normally the gendarmerie would only give chase in armoured vehicles, and nowadays, since the war with Iraq, those were in very short supply. "Well, is there any sign of it?" demanded a high-pitched voice in Farsi behind him. The policeman turned to face the squat, bearded mullah. "It is coming, Aga." He hid his irritation at the cleric's impatience. The man didn't like hanging around, getting his nice brown robe and turban clogged with dust. Still, it didn't do to upset the religious men of Allah nowadays. Captain Rahmani beckoned to the two armed policemen who stood beside the dilapidated truck, talking to the civilian driver. They came at once and, following his curt instruction, started down the hillside to meet the camel as it came into view around an outcrop. It gathered speed. The smell of humans meant another titbit of opium gum. 10 minutes later, the packages taken from the panniers had been thoroughly examined. Satisfied, the religious man extracted a wad of money from the leather pouch around his waist. He handed it to the policeman, who peeled off a few notes for his two officers. They seemed well pleased. These were hard times in Iran. They all climbed aboard the truck, which began its long journey away from the wild mountains and their hidden dangers. Without any instruction, the camel turned and started back the way it had come, as though by remote control. At a local village, Captain Rahmani and his two officers climbed down and watched the truck disappear from view towards the barren waste of desert that stretched before it. Idly he wondered how the mullah had ever got to know the bandits. Perhaps he had a relative or a contact amongst the clerics in Afghanistan on the other side of the mountains. But it didn't really matter. The important thing was that they should not be found out. Officially, the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime frowned on the growing or smuggling of opium, but Captain Rahmani knew that there were plenty of others like the impatient mullah with the squeaky voice. What he did not know, and little really cared, was that the truck would continue on to the desert city of Yazd. And before it reached the vaulted flagstone street of the centre, it turned into a dusty enclave of modern, prefabricated factory units. It drove into the lofty loading bay of one of them and parked beside a refrigerated container trailer. When the bay doors were closed, the air was rich with the smell of recently defrosted meat from the butchery department. But that was no concern of the mullah. He took his precious package to the European who waited beside his trailer. After thoroughly checking the dozens of small polythene bags contained in the larger packages, the man clambered into the back of his empty container trailer. Two workmen stood inside. They had already removed one of the aluminium panels and extracted the thick slab of solidified insulation foam behind it. They watched, with bored disinterest, as the European lifted up the top half of the 4-inch thick slab to reveal a series of neatly cut pockets. Each recess was shallow, otherwise giveaway patches of frost might form on the outside of the trailer later. So it took the man half an hour to carefully fit the dozens of tiny packets into the recesses. Satisfied, he nodded to the workmen. With practiced skill, they refitted the two halves of the foam slab together and inserted it back into the trailer wall. A new aluminium panel, which had already been left to oxidize in the factory coal store, was put into position and pop-riveted. To have reused the old panel would almost certainly have left telltale signs of tampering. The rivet heads themselves would soon discolour. And then no one would ever find the illicit cargo. Not unless his was unlucky enough to be one in 200 rigs to be checked by British Customs, and not unless they were prepared to risk contaminating his cargo, and not unless they were rash enough to rip the container apart. 1,000,000 to 1 chance. The consignment was already as good as delivered. He stood back momentarily to examine the handiwork, then strolled back down to the tailgate. To the mullah's irritation, he laconically sat down and lit a cigarette. "Right, they can load up the fruit now, and I'll be on my way." The Irish accent murdered the pidgin Farsi it attempted. But the mullah had got the message, and he had already received the money. The driver ambled back to his cab and threw the refrigeration switch. Inside the trailer, the unit began to thrum as the space was filled with a blast of cold air. He stubbed out his half-finished cigarette and stretched. He had a long, long drive in front of him. Chapter 1. The door crashed shut behind him. He was out. Billy Robson didn't believe it. He hadn't allowed himself to believe it, even when the bolt on the cell door had been rattled at 6:30 that morning. He'd been awake most of the night, snatching just the odd few moments of fitful sleep waiting for dawn. Waiting but still not believing. After 5 years' anticipation of one moment, it was difficult to believe when it eventually came. He had been the last one to leave, the last one to bow his head and step through the door in the front gate of Wormwood Scrubs. Now he stood, clutching the small hold-all, and watched. The rest of the released parolees sorted their friends and relatives from the small knot of people waiting at the end of the short, snow-covered drive. Greetings were muted, abruptly curtailed by the cons who were anxious to be away from the grim Victorian walls. Only one of them remembered him. "See you around, Billy boy. Be lucky." Robson inclined his head and watched impassively as the door of the man's taxi slammed. After 5 years, it was like stepping out of a dark cinema into bright daylight. Everything was too vivid and too loud, all bustle and movement. Too much to take in at once. The remaining people on the corner began drifting towards a waiting Cortina minicab. There was no sign of Sandy. Perhaps she'd missed the bus or couldn't get a taxi. Exhaust from the Cortina belched into the sharp, cold air, drifting across his line of vision in a billowing cloud. Slowly it eddied away. There was no one left. He was aware of the cold of the snow starting to seep up through the thin leather soles in his shoes. His nose had started to run, dampening the black hairs of the moustache he had kept since his days in the Royal Marines. In fact, coming out today reminded him of the day, 6 years earlier, when he'd stepped outside Bickley Barracks in Plymouth as a civilian. At 27 he had been free again after 9 years' service to the Crown. The memory flooded back. He had a small fist of apprehension in his gut then, a well-founded apprehension as it turned out. Within 12 months he was doing another sentence much less pleasant. 5 years for driving a bank robbery getaway car. Never again. Robson began to walk. A slow smile crossed his face. He could keep on walking now, not just 100 yards to the prison's perimeter wall, but 1,000 yards, miles, as far as he wanted. In a way he was pleased that Sandy was late. He knew which way his wife would come, so it wouldn't hurt to indulge himself in the unfamiliar sights and smells around him. Just the air, crisp and clean, not like the cloying fog of stale sweat, cigarette smoke and urine buckets you got with 3 men sharing a 13-by-7 cell every night. Even the air in the yard smelt nothing like the sweet, free air on the other side of the wall. Idly he watched as an electric milk float rattled to a halt, and the milkman carried 4 pints over to a shop doorway, whistling as he went. Robson's heart soared. What a sight for sore eyes! He grinned stupidly to himself. He was, after all, just beginning to believe it. Bleep, bleep, Hitler has only got one. The loud, sing-song blast on the musical horn made him jump. He turned to see the custom-painted E-Type swerve past the milk float. It slipped neatly across the road, through the oncoming traffic, and jerked to a halt beside him. Angry hooters united in protest. Andy Sutcliffe's head grinned up from the open window, and his hand came out to cheerfully V-sign the aggrieved motorists. "Well, if Billy Boy isn't on the run again! You didn't hang about, did you?" Robson grinned down at the unruly mop of fair hair. "With jokes like that, Andy, you and I could just fall out." "And ruin our long-running relationship? Schoolboy chums and best man and all that crap?" "Piss off." "Aren't you going to get in?" Robson leaned on the purple roof. "I'm expecting Sandy." "I know you are, Billy Boy, but you'll have to make do with me. Sand was a bit poorly this morning. She asked me if I'd do the honour of picking up our fallen idol." "Is she ill?" Sutcliffe shook his head. "Nah, nothing serious, just sick. Probably woman's troubles. Or maybe it was the few jars we had last night to celebrate you coming out." Robson laughed. "You could have waited until I was there." He had scarcely opened the door and settled into the mauve, fleece-covered passenger seat when Sutcliffe had released the clutch with a vengeance. The exhaust rumbled with menace as the garish E-Type leapt forward, prizing its way through a gap in the oncoming stream of traffic and back to the left-hand lane. A second cacophony of hooters protested as the drivers were forced to brake. "You haven't changed," Robson observed with a grin. It was good to be with his old friend again. No one else's company was ever quite as enjoyable, even if it was embarrassing on occasions. "You never mentioned your new motor." Sutcliffe chuckled as he jumped the traffic lights. "Didn't want to make you jealous. Like it?" "Truthfully, course. It's bloody awful. Who in God's name chose the colours?" "Some pop star whose roadie absconded with all the assets except the car. It was a finance company reclaim, so I got it cheap." "I can see why." Sutcliffe scratched at the thick scrub of fair curls at his chin. "It pulls the birds, no trouble. You can see the footprints on the roof." "Time you settled down, Andy, and found yourself a wife." "In time, Billy, in time. I can't afford to run an E-Type and a wife." "How's the motor trade, then?" Robson plucked at the sleeve of his friend's suede jacket. "That must have cost a bob or two." The E-Type swerved to overtake a dawdling car on the inside. "Well, I'm scratching a living, Billy Boy, you know how it is. Shifting the odd motor off the forecourt and doing a bit of ducking and diving on the side. Keep the old head above water. But what with the tax man and the VAT inspector, it ain't easy." Robson smiled to himself. Some things never changed. But he hadn't been really listening. His mind had moved on to the prospect of being reunited with Sandy. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine the creamy complexion that made her look younger than her 29 years. Those stunning grey eyes that were so often clouded with some obscure minor worry, but could be bright and laughing at the slightest provocation. And that hair. That's what made everyone fall in love with Sandy. Her hair. Soft, light, red-blonde waves with a natural hint of ginger. In his mind's eye, his gaze travelled down her pale, slender body. Suddenly the smell of her hair seemed to fill the car. The effect of it shook Robson for a moment. For 2 years now, he hadn't allowed himself to think of her in that way. not since that Christmas after